The sun was still rising over the small town in Virginia when Ryan stepped out of his modest wooden house, his coffee cup in hand. The early morning air carried a chill that hinted at the coming fall. His dog, Shadow, a strong and alert Belgian Malinois with deep brown eyes, trotted beside him. Shadow never strayed too far from Ryan, as if the bond between them was made of something more than just friendship. It was loyalty, trust, and a shared history few would ever understand. Ryan had lived in the quiet town for almost 3 years now. Most people didn't know much about him, except that he kept to himself and seemed to prefer peace and routine. His neighbors saw him as the polite man who always said hello but never joined the community barbecues or holiday parties. They didn't know that Ryan had once served as an elite Delta Force commander, leading dangerous missions in places whose names most people only heard on the news. He never spoke of those years. To him, they belonged to another life, one filled with noise, orders, and loss. Now, all he wanted was silence. He had bought the small property at the edge of town because it reminded him of the places he used to camp during training, surrounded by trees, with a small stream running nearby. Every morning, he and Shadow walked the same dirt path along the woods. Sometimes Ryan would throw a stick and Shadow would sprint after it with the precision of a trained soldier. Other times they walked quietly, as if both man and dog knew that peace didn't need words. Life was simple. Ryan woke early, cooked his own meals, and worked part-time at a small hardware store in town. He liked working with his hands. It gave him something to focus on, something real. The people at the store respected him, though they didn't know much about his past. They just knew he worked hard and never complained. At home, Shadow was his family. Ryan had trained him years ago while still in service. Shadow wasn't an ordinary dog. He was a working partner, trained to detect danger, follow commands instantly, and protect his handler at all costs. But now in retirement, Shadow was just as happy chasing squirrels and sleeping by the fire. Still, that spark of alertness never left his eyes. He always knew when something was off. One quiet evening, as Ryan sat on his porch watching the sunset, an older neighbor named Mr. Turner waved from across the street. "Evening, Ryan. Dog looks good as always." Ryan smiled. "Thanks. He keeps me on my toes." Turner chuckled and nodded. "That's a good thing. These days everyone needs a bit of company." Ryan agreed with a polite nod, but he didn't say much else. Turner meant well, but Ryan wasn't good at small talk. The truth was, he still struggled with being around people. Years of operating in high-stress environments had changed him. Crowds made him uneasy. Loud noises put him on edge. He didn't tell anyone about the nightmares that sometimes woke him up at 3 a.m., or how Shadow would nudge him awake, sensing his distress before he even opened his eyes. For Ryan, Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the one who grounded him, the one who made life after the battlefield bearable. One morning, as Ryan walked into town for supplies, he noticed a few kids playing by the park. Shadow walked beside him, calm and focused, ignoring the distractions around him. Some of the children pointed and smiled. One little boy ran up and asked if he could pet the dog. Ryan crouched down and smiled kindly. "He's friendly, but let him come to you first." The boy extended his hand carefully, and Shadow sniffed it before leaning forward for a gentle pat. The boy laughed, and Ryan's heart softened a little. Moments like these reminded him that there was still good in the world, simple, innocent good. But not everyone understood Shadow's behavior. A few people in town had whispered that Ryan's dog looked too serious, too intense. One woman at the grocery store once muttered that it wasn't safe to have a big military-type dog in a neighborhood with kids. Ryan had overheard her but stayed quiet. He knew people often feared what they didn't understand. That night, he sat by the fireplace sipping tea while Shadow rested at his feet. The quiet crackle of the fire filled the room. Ryan reached down and rubbed Shadow's neck. "They don't get you, do they, boy?" he said softly. "But that's all right. We've been through worse." Shadow raised his head slightly and looked at Ryan with calm, loyal eyes, as if he understood every word. It wasn't just the peace of the countryside that Ryan loved. It was the freedom from judgment. The feeling that here, at least, no one expected him to be anything but a man trying to live a normal life. But even in this peaceful corner of the world, trouble has a way of finding you when you least expect it. A few weeks later, a new delivery company started servicing the area. Ryan didn't pay much attention at first. Packages were dropped off at his gate. He picked them up later, But one morning, as he and Shadow were returning from their walk, a van pulled into his driveway unexpectedly. The driver, a young man in a bright orange vest, hopped out with a box and started walking straight toward the porch. Shadow's ears perked up immediately. He moved in front of Ryan, standing still but alert. Ryan called out, "You can leave it by the gate, please." But the driver didn't seem to hear him. He kept walking, eyes on his handheld scanner. Shadow barked once, and a deep, commanding sound that echoed through the yard. The driver froze, startled, and dropped the package. Ryan quickly placed his hand on Shadow's back and spoke calmly. "It's all right, boy, stay." Shadow stopped barking but kept his eyes fixed on the stranger. The driver muttered something under his breath and backed away. "Man, you should keep that dog on a leash." Almost gave me a heart attack. Ryan sighed and nodded politely. "He's trained. He won't hurt you unless he needs to." But the driver didn't seem convinced. He shook his head, got back in the van, and drove off without another word. Ryan watched him leave, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Shadow looked up at him, tail still, body tense. "You did fine," Ryan said softly. "You did exactly what you were supposed to." He tried to forget about it, but the next day he noticed a few people glancing at him differently in town. Conversation stopped when he walked by. It didn't take long before he realized that word about the aggressive dog had spread. He didn't blame them. People in small towns talked. But deep down, he hoped that would be the end of it. He didn't know that the misunderstanding would grow far beyond a few whispers. That night, Ryan stood outside looking up at the stars. The world felt both vast and small at once. He thought about his years in service, the missions, the men he'd lost, and the promise he made to himself when he retired, to never again be part of violence. He wanted peace, and he thought he had found it. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but still aware of every sound. Ryan smiled faintly and whispered, "We're good here, aren't we?" Shadow's tail thumped lightly on the porch. He didn't know that this peace, this fragile, quiet life, was about to be tested in a way he never imagined. But for now, as the wind rustled through the trees and the night wrapped around them like a blanket, Ryan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally left the battles behind. The next few days passed quietly, but Ryan could sense that something in the town had shifted. People still nodded at him on the street, but their smiles seemed tighter, their eyes curious. He wasn't someone who cared much about gossip, but it was hard not to notice the way conversation stopped when he walked into the store, or how a few mothers pulled their kids closer when Shadow was near. He didn't blame them, not really. Fear spread fast in small towns, and one wrong story could grow into something far bigger than the truth. Ryan tried to brush it off. He kept his focus on work, taking extra shifts at the hardware store, and spent his evenings walking the same trail with Shadow. The woods were the only place that still felt untouched by judgment. Shadow trotted beside him, head high, always alert but calm. Ryan found comfort in the steady rhythm of his steps and the sound of leaves crunching beneath his boots. Out there, it was just the two of them again. No rumors, no looks, no questions. One Friday morning, Ryan received a letter from the county animal control department. The paper was folded neatly, but the tone was stiff. It stated that a report had been made about his dog, posing a potential safety risk to the community. They wanted to inspect the property and assess the animal's behavior. The words were polite, but Ryan could read between the lines. Someone had complained, and now the authorities were involved. He sighed deeply and set the letter down on the kitchen table. Shadow was lying nearby, chewing lazily on his toy rope. Ryan rubbed his forehead and muttered, "Looks like we've got company coming, buddy." The visit was scheduled for Monday morning. Over the weekend, Ryan cleaned up the yard, repaired the fence, and made sure Shadow's papers were in order. He still had all of Shadow's service records from the military, proof of training and certification. He even printed out a few documents explaining that Shadow was a retired working dog, fully obedient and non-aggressive unless provoked. When Monday came, a white county truck pulled into his driveway right on time. Two officers stepped out, a man and a woman, both in uniform, wearing calm but official expressions. Ryan greeted them politely at the gate. "Good morning," he said, keeping his tone steady. "I assume you're here about the letter." The female officer smiled briefly. "Yes, sir. We received a report about your dog. We just need to make sure everything's fine." Ryan nodded. "Of course. You're welcome to take a look. Shadow's right here. Shadow stood beside him, silent but watchful. His ears twitched, eyes moving between the two strangers. Ryan gave a quiet command, and Shadow sat down immediately, tail still, waiting. The male officer raised an eyebrow. He's well trained. Ryan gave a small smile. You could say that. He served overseas. He's been trained to follow commands exactly. They asked a few questions. How long Ryan had owned him, whether Shadow had ever bitten anyone, and if he was properly licensed. Ryan answered everything calmly, showing them paperwork and even letting them observe Shadow from a short distance. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until a third vehicle pulled into the driveway, a marked police cruiser. The animal control officers exchanged glances but didn't say much. A uniformed police officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked toward them. Ryan tensed slightly but stayed composed. "Morning," the officer said. "I was asked to assist with this inspection." Ryan nodded. "You're welcome to observe, officer. We're just finishing up here." The officer looked past Ryan toward Shadow. "That the dog in question?" "Yes," Ryan replied evenly. "His name's Shadow." The officer frowned slightly. "Big dog. You sure he's safe around people?" Ryan met his eyes. "Safer than most people I've met." There was a small pause. The animal control officers tried to ease the tension by saying they just needed to complete their notes. They asked if they could walk a little closer. Ryan agreed but made them stop a few feet away. "Just don't reach for him suddenly," he said. "He doesn't like that." The woman nodded, taking out her phone to record a short video of Shadow sitting calmly by Ryan's side. Everything was fine until the male officer decided to test something. Without warning, he clapped his hands loudly, as if to see how Shadow would react. Shadow stood instantly alert but not aggressive, his tail stiff, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Ryan held up a hand. "Easy, boy, sit." Shadow obeyed immediately, sitting again, though his eyes stayed locked on the man who had startled him. The officer stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. The woman turned to Ryan. "He reacted, but he's under control. I'd say he's fine. I'll note that he's well trained." Ryan exhaled slowly. "Appreciate that." They thanked him for his cooperation and left. The police officer lingered a moment longer, still looking at Shadow before finally walking back to his car. Ryan stood at the gate watching all three vehicles leave. As they disappeared down the road, he rubbed Shadow's head and whispered, "You did good, buddy. Real good." For a while it seemed that the matter was over. The days that followed were quiet again, and Ryan returned to his normal routine. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the visit hadn't sat right. The way the police officer had looked at Shadow, with that mix of caution and doubt, stayed with him. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Another van, another driver, this time from a courier service Ryan hadn't seen before. Ryan was inside fixing a loose window latch when Shadow barked once, sharp and alert. Ryan stepped outside to see a man standing halfway up his porch steps holding a package. Shadow was at the base of the stairs, barking again, not attacking, just warning. "Sir," Ryan called out, "please stay where you are." He's trained to protect the house, but the man didn't listen. "I'm just delivering this," he shouted, holding the box higher. Shadow's barking grew louder. Ryan hurried forward, raising his voice. "Set it down and step back, please." Finally, the man dropped the package and retreated quickly to his van, muttering something angry as he left. Shadow stopped barking the moment the man drove off. Ryan crouched beside him, rubbing his back. "You did what you're supposed to do," he said softly. "Don't worry. You didn't do anything wrong." Still, Ryan had a sinking feeling in his chest. He knew what would come next, another report, another round of questions. And he was right. The following morning, 2 police cars arrived, this time without warning. 3 officers stepped out, one of them holding what looked like tranquilizer equipment. Ryan walked out to meet them, Shadow close beside him. "Morning, officers," he said calmly. "Can I ask what this is about?" One of them, a middle-aged sergeant, replied, "We received another complaint about an aggressive animal on your property. We're here to investigate and possibly remove the dog for evaluation." Ryan's stomach tightened. "Remove him? On what grounds? He hasn't hurt anyone." "That's for the department to determine," the sergeant said, keeping his tone firm but neutral. "We just need to take him for assessment. If everything checks out, he'll be returned." Ryan took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. With all due respect, this dog is a decorated service animal. "You're not taking him anywhere without a warrant." The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped closer. Shadow stood his ground, eyes fixed, muscles tense. Ryan quickly gave him a hand signal and Shadow sat again, still alert but silent. The sergeant sighed. "Look, we don't want trouble. Just cooperate and this will go smoothly." Ryan shook his head. "You're not taking him. Not like this." The standoff lasted only a few moments, but it felt like forever. The officers clearly weren't prepared for someone who knew his rights and wasn't afraid to stand his ground. Finally, the sergeant muttered something into his radio and stepped back. "We'll be back," he said flatly, "with proper paperwork." They left, and Ryan stood there in silence, the morning air thick with tension. Shadow leaned against his leg as if sensing his unease. Ryan knelt and looked into his dog's eyes. "They don't understand you," he whispered. "They don't understand what we've been through." That night, Ryan barely slept. He sat by the window, staring out into the dark yard, waiting for headlights that never came. Shadow lay at his feet, calm but watchful as always. Ryan knew that the peace he had built was starting to crumble. He didn't know when, but he could feel it. Something bigger was coming, and this time it wouldn't end with a simple conversation. The next few days felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Ryan tried to go about his usual routine, but every time he stepped outside, he couldn't help glancing down the road, half expecting to see flashing lights again. The peace that once filled his mornings had turned into quiet tension. Even Shadow seemed to sense it. The dog was still calm, still obedient, but his alertness had sharpened. Every sound, a car door slamming, a branch snapping, made his ears perk up. Ryan wasn't angry at the officers. Not really. He had dealt with people who didn't understand things before. What bothered him most was the feeling of helplessness. The thought that, despite everything he had done for his country, despite all the discipline and loyalty he had given, it could all be ignored because of a misunderstanding. He reminded himself to stay calm. He believed reason would win out. He believed if he just cooperated and stayed respectful, this would pass. A week later, on a quiet Thursday morning, Ryan woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, filling the kitchen with soft orange light. He poured himself a cup of coffee, scratched Shadow behind the ears, and sat down by the window. The world looked peaceful again for a moment. Birds chirped in the trees, and the stream behind the house reflected the early glow of dawn. For a brief second, he allowed himself to think maybe the worst was over. But then he heard the sound of engines. More than one. He stepped outside and saw 2 police vehicles and another animal control truck pulling into his driveway. His stomach tightened instantly. This time it wasn't a friendly check-in. The officers moved with purpose. He counted at least 5 of them. Shadow stood beside him on the porch, silent but alert. Ryan took a deep breath and walked down to the gate. "Morning," he said evenly. "Can I ask what this is about?" The same sergeant from before stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Ryan, we have a court-approved order to remove your dog for evaluation. There have been multiple reports, and we need to make sure the animal isn't a public threat." Ryan's chest tightened. "You're making a mistake. He hasn't hurt anyone." The sergeant kept his tone steady. "Sir, I understand your position, but we have to follow procedure." Ryan looked at the papers the sergeant was holding. The document had an official seal and a signature. It looked real. He knew there wasn't much he could do legally at that moment, but he also knew he couldn't just hand Shadow over to strangers who didn't understand what he was. He swallowed hard. "I'm asking you to be careful with him. He's trained to respond to my commands. If anyone acts aggressive, he'll think it's a threat." The sergeant nodded. "We'll keep that in mind." Ryan looked down at Shadow. "Stay," he whispered softly. The dog didn't move. The officers began to approach slowly, speaking in calm voices. Ryan could tell they were trying to do things by the book, but there was tension in the air. The kind that made people nervous and unpredictable. One of the officers held a catch pole, the kind used to control aggressive animals. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. He held up a hand. "That's not necessary. He's calm. Let me put him on a leash." The sergeant hesitated, then nodded. "All right, go ahead." Ryan turned and reached for Shadow's leash hanging by the porch. He clipped it onto the collar and spoke gently. "Easy, boy. We're okay." Shadow's eyes never left the officers. His tail was stiff, his muscles tight. Then something small but important went wrong. One of the younger officers standing near the gate made a sudden move, maybe adjusting his radio or stepping forward too quickly. Shadow barked sharply, one loud, commanding sound, the kind of bark that meant stop. The officers froze, but one of them panicked. He raised his hand defensively, and in that split second, Shadow took a step forward, still on the leash. "Wait," Ryan shouted, tightening his grip. "He's not attacking." But before anyone could react properly, the officer holding the catch pole fired a tranquilizer dart. The sharp hiss broke the silence. Shadow yelped and stumbled back. Ryan dropped to his knees beside him as confusion filled the air. "What did you do?" Ryan cried out, his voice cracking. He wasn't attacking. The sergeant turned quickly toward his team.
"Hold fire."
"Hold fire!" But it was too late. Shadow's breathing became shallow, his body trembling as the tranquilizer took effect. Ryan's hand shook as he held his dog's head gently, whispering, "You're okay, buddy. Stay with me." The officers looked uneasy now, realizing they had acted too fast. The sergeant knelt down beside Ryan. "We didn't mean—" "Stop," Ryan said sharply, his voice breaking. "Just stop talking." He stayed there, kneeling in the dirt as Shadow's breathing slowed. A long minute passed before one of the animal control officers stepped closer, checking for signs of life. She looked up, her face pale. "He's gone." Ryan froze. His mind couldn't process the words. Gone. The word echoed in his head louder than any gunfire he had ever heard in combat. He stared down at Shadow's still body, his throat tightening, his eyes burning. Everything else faded. The sound of radios crackling, the shifting feet of the officers, the murmured apologies. None of it mattered. The sergeant stood there, speechless. He tried to say something, but no words came. The silence that followed was heavier than any moment Ryan had ever lived through. He wasn't angry in that instant, just hollow. A part of him felt like it had been ripped away. Ryan slowly stood up, still holding Shadow's collar in his hand. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "You need to leave." "Sir, we need to file a report. You've done enough." Ryan interrupted quietly. "Leave." The officers hesitated, but the sergeant finally gave a small nod. "Let's go," he said to his team. They backed away slowly, unsure what else to do. Within minutes, the sound of engines faded down the road, leaving Ryan alone in the yard. He stood there for a long time, not moving, just staring at the ground. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called. It felt like the world should have stopped, but it didn't. Life went on, even as his own world had shattered. Ryan lifted Shadow's body gently and carried him to the back of the property, near the stream where they used to walk every morning. He dug the earth with his own hands, not caring about the dirt or the pain in his muscles. When the hole was deep enough, he laid Shadow down softly, covering him with soil until the ground was level again. He sat there until night fell, staring at the spot in silence. When he finally went back inside, the house felt painfully empty. The leash still hung by the door. The bowl on the floor was still half full of water. Ryan sat at the table, staring at nothing, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to cry, but couldn't. Years of training had taught him to control his emotions, to keep calm no matter the situation. But that same discipline now felt like a prison. He couldn't release the pain, couldn't scream, couldn't even speak. That night he didn't sleep. Every sound from outside made his heart jump, a habit he thought he had left behind long ago. In the darkness, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Shadow," over and over, as if the words could change what had happened. By morning, the news had already started to spread. Neighbors talked in hushed tones, some expressing sympathy, others wondering what really happened. A few of them left small notes or flowers at his gate, but Ryan didn't open the door. He couldn't face anyone yet. He didn't want pity or explanations. All he wanted was the peace he had once found beside his loyal friend. As the days went by, Ryan knew he couldn't stay silent forever. What had happened wasn't just about him or his dog. It was about something larger, something broken in the way people saw loyalty, service, and responsibility. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but one thing was clear in his mind. This wasn't the end. Not for him and not for Shadow. For days, Ryan barely spoke to anyone. The house felt silent, too silent, without the sound of paws on the wooden floor or the quiet breathing beside him at night. The emptiness followed him everywhere. When he made his morning coffee, when he walked down the path by the woods, when he came home and saw the empty spot by the door where Shadow used to wait for him. It wasn't just the loss of a pet. It felt like losing a part of himself, the last piece of his old life that still made sense. The small town buzzed quietly with whispers about what had happened. Some people said the police had gone too far, while others said they were only doing their job. Ryan didn't care what anyone said. He kept to himself, moving through his days in a haze. The only thing that kept him from falling apart completely was the thought that Shadow didn't deserve to be forgotten. Not after everything they had been through together. One morning, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from a local reporter who had heard about the incident. The note was short and polite. It said she wanted to hear Ryan's side of the story, and that people deserved to know what really happened. Ryan stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't want attention, but he also knew staying silent meant letting others tell the story their way, and that wasn't something he could live with. The next day, he called the number written at the bottom of the note. The reporter's voice was calm and respectful. She didn't rush him or push for answers. She just asked if they could meet. They agreed to talk at a small diner on the edge of town. When Ryan walked in, he felt uneasy. He hadn't sat in a public place in weeks. The smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with a notebook in front of her, smiled when she saw him. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Ryan nodded and sat down. "I don't usually do this," he admitted. "I understand," she said. "You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with. I just want the truth." He looked out the window for a moment before speaking. "The truth is simple. My dog was my partner. He was trained, disciplined, and loyal. He didn't deserve what happened." The reporter listened carefully, writing notes as he spoke. Ryan told her about the complaints, the visits, and the morning the officers came back with papers. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize it. He just told the story as it was, his voice steady but heavy with grief. When he finished, the reporter sat quietly for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "This shouldn't have happened." Ryan gave a small nod. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I just want accountability." The story appeared in the local paper 3 days later. The headline was simple but powerful. "Decorated veteran's dog wrongly taken and killed during botched animal control operation." It didn't take long for the story to spread. Soon it was being shared online, and within a week, larger news outlets picked it up. People across the country began to talk about it, not just because of what had happened to Shadow, but because of who Ryan was. Someone had found his military record and shared it. The public learned that he was a former Delta Force commander who had served with distinction in several high-risk missions overseas. He had received medals for bravery, leadership, and service. People couldn't understand how someone who had given so much could be treated with such disregard. Messages began flooding in, from other veterans, from animal trainers, from ordinary people who felt outraged. Support groups reached out offering help, legal advice, and even counseling. For the first time since it all happened, Ryan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone anymore. Within days, news vans started appearing near the edge of his property. Reporters waited by the road, hoping for a comment. Ryan avoided them at first, not because he didn't want to speak, but because he wanted to make sure he said the right thing. He didn't want anger to lead the way. He wanted purpose. When he finally agreed to a televised interview, he wore a plain jacket, nothing flashy. He stood outside his home, near the wooden fence where Shadow used to sit. The reporter asked him gentle but direct questions. "How do you feel about what happened?" Ryan looked into the camera for a long moment before answering. "I feel like something broke that day," he said softly. "Not just for me, but for everyone who believes in fairness and accountability. Shadow wasn't just my dog. He was my partner. We served together. He saved lives overseas, and yet back home he wasn't given the respect he deserved." The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning it had gone viral. Social media exploded with messages of support. People demanded an investigation. A petition started online, calling for justice for Shadow and for stricter rules on how animal control and police handle service animals. Within 48 hours, it had over 1 million signatures. Meanwhile, local officials began to feel the pressure. The county sheriff's office released a short statement saying they were reviewing the incident, but the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted real answers. Ryan started receiving calls from lawyers offering to represent him pro bono. He didn't want to turn it into a circus, but he also knew this was the only way to make sure what happened to Shadow never happened again. Eventually, he agreed to work with a veterans legal foundation. They helped him file an official complaint and prepare for a federal hearing. The process was slow, filled with paperwork and meetings, but Ryan stayed focused. Every time he felt tired or frustrated, he thought about Shadow, about their long walks, their quiet mornings, the trust in those brown eyes. That memory kept him steady. As the case gained national attention, people began sending letters to Ryan's home. Some were from families who had lost service animals under similar circumstances. Others were from complete strangers offering words of comfort. He read each one carefully, humbled by how many people cared. One evening, as he sat by the fire reading through a stack of letters, he found one that stood out. It was written by a young soldier who said Shadow's story had inspired him to train as a canine handler. "Your dog's loyalty reminded me what it means to serve with heart," the letter said. Ryan read it twice, feeling something warm in his chest for the first time in weeks. When the court hearings finally began, the courtroom was full. Reporters filled the back rows. Outside, people held signs with Shadow's name on them. Ryan sat quietly at the front, his expression calm but firm. He listened as the officers and animal control staff gave their statements. Some admitted they had acted too quickly. Others tried to shift the blame. But when it was his turn to speak, the entire room fell silent. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the witness stand. His voice was calm and steady. "I served my country for many years," he began. "I've seen things most people couldn't imagine. I've lost friends in combat. I've learned what it means to protect, to respect, and to value life. My dog Shadow was more than a companion. He was part of that service. He helped save lives, and when we came home, I thought we'd both finally found peace. But instead, he was taken from me by people who didn't take the time to understand." He paused for a moment, his voice tightening slightly. "This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Not to another veteran, not to another family, not to another dog who's given everything." By the time he finished, the room was silent. Even the judge seemed moved. The hearings continued for several days, but it was clear by the end that Ryan had struck a chord. The court ruled that the officers had acted without proper cause and that the department had failed to follow protocol. A formal apology was issued, and the county agreed to implement new training programs for all officers and animal control staff. The news spread quickly. People celebrated the decision across social media, calling it a victory not just for Ryan but for justice and compassion. Ryan didn't celebrate. He just stood quietly by the stream behind his home, where he had buried Shadow. The water flowed gently, and the trees swayed in the evening breeze. He whispered, "We did it, buddy. You're not forgotten." For the first time in a long while, Ryan felt a small sense of peace. The pain was still there, and it always would be, but now it carried meaning. The world had finally seen Shadow for who he truly was, not just a dog, but a symbol of loyalty, courage, and love. Months passed after the court ruling, and life slowly began to return to a quiet rhythm for Ryan. The snow had melted, and the fields around his home were turning green again. Birds chirped early in the mornings, and the air smelled of spring. But the silence inside the house still lingered. He had won the case, yes, but victory didn't erase the emptiness left behind. Every corner of the home still carried a memory. The small rug near the fireplace, the dent in the old couch, even the leash hanging by the door, all silent reminders of a friend who had once filled the house with life. Ryan spent most of his days outside now. He worked on fixing the old barn, repaired fences, and tended to a small garden behind the house. Manual labor helped him think, helped him breathe. Sometimes he would take long walks to the ridge behind the woods where he and Shadow used to train. It had been their place, a quiet stretch of land overlooking the valley. There Ryan would sit for hours, listening to the wind and remembering the times they had shared. One afternoon, while walking back from the ridge, Ryan saw a car parked near his mailbox. A woman stepped out holding a folder. She introduced herself as a representative from a national veterans organization. She had read his story and wanted to meet him in person. Ryan offered her coffee, and they sat outside on the porch. She spoke kindly, thanking him for his service and for standing up for justice. Then she told him something that caught his attention. The organization was starting a new program, a training center for service dogs, especially for veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress or physical injuries. They wanted to name it after Shadow, as a symbol of loyalty and courage. Ryan didn't speak for a while. He just looked out toward the horizon, the sun setting in shades of orange and gold. Shadow would have liked that, he finally said. He always had a way of helping people without even trying. A few weeks later, Ryan found himself standing in front of a half-built training facility in another state. The air smelled of sawdust and new beginnings. Workers were moving around, setting up fences and laying concrete paths. The woman from the veterans group introduced him to the team, trainers, volunteers, and other veterans who would be part of the project. They all greeted him warmly, some shaking his hand, others simply nodding with respect. They showed him a section of the building where a small plaque would be placed. It read, "The Shadow Project, in honor of loyalty beyond duty." Ryan stood there for a long time, tracing the words with his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. The feeling in his chest said it all. Over the next few months, Ryan became deeply involved in the project. He helped design the training courses, shared his knowledge about military canine handling, and mentored younger veterans. Working with the dogs gave him purpose again. He felt alive in a way he hadn't since losing Shadow. Each new dog reminded him of the strength and intelligence that had defined his old partner. One dog in particular caught his attention, a black German Shepherd pup with bright eyes and endless energy. The trainers called him Scout. He was sharp but restless, full of curiosity and always getting into trouble. Something about the dog reminded Ryan of Shadow's early days. Wild but eager to please, Ryan decided to personally help train Scout. Day after day, they worked together in the open field. Ryan taught him hand signals, commands, and trust. It wasn't easy at first. The dog was stubborn and distracted, but slowly Scout began to listen. There were moments when Ryan would catch the dog looking at him with that same loyal gaze he used to see in Shadow. It was as if the past and the present had quietly found a way to meet. As the months rolled by, the facility officially opened. Veterans from across the country came to attend training programs and therapy sessions. Some came with their own dogs, while others were paired with new companions. Ryan watched as men and women, once burdened by silence and memories, began to smile again. The dogs gave them something no medicine could: connection. During the grand opening ceremony, Ryan was asked to give a short speech. He wasn't comfortable with public speaking, but he couldn't say no. Standing before a small crowd of veterans, families, and community members, he cleared his throat and began. "Years ago," he said softly, "I served with some of the finest men and women this country has ever known. But one of the best soldiers I ever worked with didn't wear a uniform. He walked on 4 legs and never asked for anything in return. Shadow taught me more about loyalty and courage than most people ever could. When he was taken from me, I thought I'd lost my purpose. But today, looking at all of you and these incredible dogs, I realize his story didn't end. It just found a new beginning." The crowd was silent for a moment, then broke into gentle applause. Ryan smiled, his eyes glistening slightly as he stepped down. That night, as the event wrapped up, he stood outside under the stars with Scout lying beside him. The dog rested his head on Ryan's boot, just like Shadow used to. The sky was clear and a soft breeze brushed against his face. He whispered quietly, "You'd be proud of this, buddy." From that day forward, Ryan's life began to change. He still carried the pain, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was more like a scar, a reminder of something that mattered deeply. He kept working with the organization, helping train more dogs and mentoring veterans who had lost their own sense of direction. He found comfort in giving others what Shadow had given him, a reason to keep going. Over time, the Shadow Project became known nationwide. It helped hundreds of veterans find healing and support. Documentaries were made about it, schools invited Ryan to speak, and people began writing to thank him for turning his loss into something meaningful. Ryan never sought fame, but he accepted the attention because it meant more awareness for the cause. One evening, years later, Ryan returned to his old home. The house had aged, but it still felt familiar. He walked down to the stream behind the house, the place where he had once whispered his final words to Shadow. The trees were taller now, the air calmer. Scout, older but still strong, followed him quietly. Ryan sat by the water for a long time, lost in thought. The reflection of the sunset danced on the surface. "You changed a lot of lives," he said softly, as if speaking to the wind. "You didn't just save me, you saved so many others." Scout lay down beside him, letting out a quiet sigh. Ryan reached over and patted his head. "You remind me of him," he said. "Same stubborn heart." As twilight settled in, Ryan looked up at the sky and smiled. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest felt lighter. He realized that Shadow's story wasn't one of tragedy. It was one of loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. It was a story that would live on through every dog that helped another veteran find peace. A few months later, Ryan received an invitation to a national event honoring veterans and service animals. The organizers wanted to recognize his work with the Shadow Project. The ceremony was held in a large hall filled with people: soldiers, families, trainers, and service dogs of all breeds. Ryan sat quietly in the front row as a speaker took the stage. The man spoke about courage, service, and compassion. Then he called Ryan up. As Ryan walked to the stage, the audience stood and applauded. He accepted a small medal, not for his past in Delta Force, but for his dedication to helping others heal. He looked out over the crowd and saw rows of veterans sitting with their dogs, calm, proud, and whole again. "This isn't just for me," Ryan said into the microphone. "This is for every veteran who came home and didn't know where they belonged. And it's for every dog that stood beside them, without question, without fear. This is for Shadow, and for the bond that reminds us that loyalty doesn't end when the mission does." The applause that followed was long and heartfelt. That night, Ryan returned to his hotel, sat by the window, and looked out at the quiet city below. Scout slept at his feet. The lights of the city shimmered like stars, and Ryan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He knew that somewhere, in some way, Shadow was still with him. The next morning, before heading home, Ryan stopped by a small park nearby. There was a statue there, a bronze sculpture of a soldier kneeling beside a dog. The plaque beneath it simply read, "For those who served together." Ryan stood there in silence for a while, his hand resting gently on the statue's base. A tear slipped down his cheek, but this time, it wasn't from pain. It was from gratitude. He whispered one last time, "Thank you, my friend." And with that, he turned and walked away, Scout trotting faithfully by his side, ready for whatever came next. The sun was rising behind them, golden light spilling across the path, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt whole again.